Welcome back to the second segment of Civil Discourse Now. February 25th, 2012. We're coming to you from Big Hat Books in Broad Ripple, Indiana. Broad Ripple section of Indianapolis, Indiana. I'm Mark Small, co-host with Paul Ogden.
Morning, Mark.
Hi, Paul. And we are here with Kurt Lorey and Jeff Cox, our guests, discussing whether the U.S. is biased towards Israel. And we were going through some of the old history and background in the Middle East. So the second diaspora, Jews were killed. They were expelled from Palestine, from what was then called Palestine, and they dispersed over Western Europe and into Africa and stuff, but they were no longer there. And then what followed from about then to the 20th century, beginning of the 20th century, was constant prejudice. I mean, there were laws in countries that Jews could not own land.
Well, not constant. I mean, places in the Middle East, they weren't.
Well, that's okay.
There.
That's a good point.
Well, some places they were prejudiced.
Very few places in the Middle East where they suffer prejudice during the Middle Ages. It was in Christendom where they suffered the most, especially places like Jeff mentioned earlier, where the Spanish Inquisition held sway.
And they had actually flourished in Spain until the Spanish Inquisition. Mm-hmm. And then they didn't expect the Spanish Inquisition, and it occurred, and then they were expelled there. But then in Europe in general, there were laws against ownership of land, which was a big factor in wealth.
Well, why that figured into the banking business in Italy. You have Shakespeare, who basically, in his play, The Merchant of Venice, documenting the prejudice that Jews felt directed towards them in Europe at the time. During the late 1800s in England, there was tremendous prejudice toward Jews as the economy faltered when they were making the switch over from more of an agricultural economy to the Industrial Revolution. A lot of people lost their jobs, and they blamed the Jews for that.
And let's back up a second. Because Jews could not own land, they had to choose alternative methods of keeping, maintaining, acquiring wealth, and that meant they became artisans, craftsmen, and they became members of the professions, doctors, lawyers, but then they also could they could own money. And as a consequence of that, some of the great banks of Europe were owned by Jews. And so they had the capital, and they got blamed when economies faltered.
That's correct.
And so in the late 1800s, 1870s or so, there began to develop a concept that we call Zionism, and that was that Jews should go back to have a national shrine or a national place in what was then Palestine still, and it hadn't developed into a nation state. They wanted a national home.
Well, right in the 1800s, Palestine, Israel was part of the Ottoman Empire. Mm-hmm. The big impetus in the 1800s for the creation of a Jewish state was not England or anything in Western Europe. It was probably Russia. Russia was the place that was the worst for the Jews. There was called the Pale of Jewish Settlement, which encompassed most of the inhabitable areas of Western Russia. The Jews could only live in that area, but they couldn't live in cities in that area.
And that was where the concept of, in the Middle Ages, that was where the concept of the ghetto arose. Because the ghetto was that area in which, the only areas in which Jews could live.
Yeah, and also there were significant pogroms against Jews.
And explain a pogrom.
A pogrom is basically an instance where it's a specific time period, like maybe a couple days, or the night of the broken glass. Kristallnacht. That was a pogrom, where you go out there, you destroy Jewish businesses, you kill Jews in a set period of time. They had those repeatedly over Russia, or in Russia during the late 1800s, especially after the murder of Tsar Alexander. The Jewish position in Russia became untenable, and people would turn against the Jews. They would kill them, they'd smash their businesses, they'd burn their houses. Specific instances of that, specific periods of that were pogroms. And it was decided at that point that the Jewish position in Russia was untenable and they needed to go someplace else. And so they thought, well, you know, they're from Israel. Makes sense.
Well, and that was when Herzl is credited with being the author of Zionism. In 1897, he wrote a book that is pointed to as being key for. It was Theodor Herzl wrote a history. The history of Zionism supposedly begins with him, but there were enclaves of Jewish settlements in Palestine that embraced the notion of a creation of a Jewish state in the 1870s, and so that was kind of. But still, by 1900. The concentration of Jews in Palestine was only about 8% of the population. It wasn't very high at all. And then you have the 20th century, and there was a trilogy, I don't remember the author's name, about the rise of Nazi Germany and Hitler's rule in Germany, and then Germany during the war, in which the author points out that there was a great deal of tolerance in certain countries in Europe compared to others, and that Germany was one of the most tolerant of, I don't know why you'd say tolerant, but where they recognized the rights of Jews as being people, as compared to Poland, was very prejudicial.
Well, yeah, during the Russian pogroms in the late Tsarist period, a number of the Jews would flee to Germany because Germany was they felt it was a haven for them. And a number of them went to Palestine during that time. I think there was an uptick in Jewish population of Palestine, Israel, in the late 1800s because the Ottomans didn't like the Russians, and so they were happy to take some of them in there. Not too many, because they're seen as a distinct ethnic group. But when you look at Germany, Germany was happy to have them at that point. They were also enemies of the Russians. And so it was strange for Germany to turn as hostile as it did, based on its history.
And Kurt, you were mentioning a couple minutes ago about, and I don't mean to go back and forth in time, but let's go to the cultures in the Middle East that were compatible, that were having no problems in living with.
I don't think it was that the cultures were compatible as much as there is. There's religious compatibility because they both trace, the Old Testament back. I think that the tolerance was that the system of religion and government that was extant was so that they tolerated non-assimilated groups. If you wanted to worship Yahweh, you could, and they were okay with that. In Europe, that was not a popular non-assimilation was not popular, and that's I think why Jews were blamed for a lot of things, because they always refused to assimilate into the culture.
Well, there was
the Roman system was based on assimilation. The Romans were the great assimilators, and they refused to play that game.
The Arab world had its own ghetto concept, and that was
true,
also
but they let them run their own governments. They didn't have pogroms against them.
Well, there were some, not many, but there were some.
Well, it was a lot more tolerant, I think, in Ottoman lands and.
Well, I'm not so sure. I'd say tolerant. I mean, they were tolerant, but you had to pay some pretty decent sized taxes. It was called the dhimmi. That was their version of the ghetto. You had to live in a particular place. You were not considered a full citizen. You didn't have the same rights as a Muslim if you were a Jew or a Christian. You didn't have the same rights as Muslims. You had to pay special taxes. You weren't trusted in courts.
But I do believe they were able to own land.
What areas of the Middle East are we talking about? Specifically, what countries would we be talking about today that had those?
We'd be talking about pretty much all of the Arab world. had the concept of the dhimmi, and the Turks had it. They called
and
it
the Persians, who aren't Arabs.
yeah, and the Turks had the same kind. They called it the millet system, but it was the same thing. One of the reasons in the former Yugoslavia why there was such hatred of the Muslims by the Serbs and the Croats was a remnant of this system. The Serbs remember as a society having to pay those taxes, being forced to live in certain areas, being able to hold only certain jobs, being at the mercy of the Muslim population, and they refused to live that way again. And that was the way it was throughout the Middle East, unless you were a Muslim. That's why the people converted to Islam so quickly, of course. They wouldn't have to pay these taxes, so they could have their rights respected.
Well, but when I'm looking at the history of the spread of Islam and how it went from a relatively small area on a very desolate peninsula to spreading across Europe, I don't think it was because this band of nomadic people suddenly had the ability to impose their will on people and exact taxes. There's also an element of Islam where it's encouraged, whereas in the Bible for Judeo-Christianity, it's encouraged that you tithe 10%. Is that New Testament?
I think it's old.
Okay. Yeah, I'm an atheist, but it's like you tithe 10% to the church, whereas in Islam, you're supposed to give to the poor. And I think that was one factor, and certainly is a factor today, that engenders a lot of positive.
I don't know if it mentions a specific percent.
I don't think that it is a percent, but I think that it's encouraged. It's encouraged giving to the poor and not to an institution like the church. And then when you're talking about non-tolerance, I mean, you look at Western Europe. After Martin Luther put the 95 Theses on the door of Wittenberg, then you had 100 years of warfare. So that's kind of showing the level of intolerance in the Christian.
Yeah, but you can also turn that on its head, where you have the Muslims, attacking out of Arabia, attacking the Eastern Roman Empire, driving them from the Holy Land, which was the impetus for the Crusades, driving westward across North Africa, which were Christian areas. That's pretty intolerant on their part, I think you could argue.
Well, I'm not going to dispute that when people militarily move in conquest, that it's somehow like a passive thing. I mean, inherently, it's a war, but in those times, people were conquering all over the place if they could. It was conquer or be conquered.
Well, and I think for Islam, it wasn't so much that they were so great warriors, but in Palestine to Asia Minor, there was a dearth of manpower there. The Eastern Romans and who was that? They were fighting the Parthians or
Persians. Sasanic Persians.
Those guys had worn each other out, and they exhausted the manpower on stupid wars.
There was also Rome during the late Empire. They were hit by a number of plagues.
Well, plus in Egypt, the big thing in Egypt was the Arabs said, "Hey, you come on our side, and we'll let you do whatever you want," because Egypt was full of what everybody else considered heretics. Arianism was big in Egypt, and they were considered heretics.
And there were different. I think the Gnostic sects were big in Egypt.
Well, but that had a lot fewer people. I mean, Arianism was big in Egypt. That was, the population went over it.
We're at the end of segment 2. We'll be right back.
The green and then the socialists.
Okay, we're at the end of the second segment. I got to cut you off there, and we'll be right.